The sun shone brightly in the sky as two men stood in front of a vast mountain range. One of them, a silver-haired man, held a flag in his hand, while the other, a brown-haired man with a shovel resting on his shoulder, smiled to himself. He thought with excitement that his name was Suho Kim, but in this world, he was known as Lloyd Frontera. For little puppies present in front of them, watching with curiosity. With a determined expression, he slammed his shovel onto the ground, and suddenly, shock waves of energy spread out in a perfect circle. The earth trembled beneath them, and as if by magic, enormous buildings began to rise from the ground, forming an entire city before their eyes. He looked at the breathtaking sight and thought with pride that this was the story of how an ordinary civil engineering student turned an entire world upside down. He turned to the silver-haired man and called his name, Javier. Javier nodded in response and asked with respect what his master, Lloyd, needed. Lloyd threw his arms up and laughed loudly, declaring that everything in front of them was money. Javier stared at him with confusion and asked if he had finally lost his mind. A few years earlier, Suho had fallen to the ground, and suddenly, mysterious messages had started appearing in front of him like a floating screen. A loud alarm rang, and a message informed him that he had been chosen to have a random wish granted by the Absolute. A moment later, another message congratulated him and revealed that he was now a character in a story called Knight of Blood and Iron. His mind filled with shock as he tried to process what was happening. He thought in disbelief about the name of the book and realized that it was the very same novel he had been reading just the night before. Messages continued to appear on the glowing screen in front of Suho's eyes. The words flashed brightly, wishing him good luck and telling him that he had got this. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. He thought in confusion about the mention of a wish, and wondered what exactly he needed luck for. He had not even had anything to drink, and now he was facing this strange situation. Then, a sudden realization struck him, making his eyes widen with shock. He spoke to himself in disbelief, questioning whether this was one of those web novels where someone possessed a character from another world. His heart pounded as the truth started to settle in. He asked himself in panic if he had really ended up in a completely different world. As he slowly gathered his thoughts, another question popped into his mind. If he had been transported into another world, then why was he waking up face down on a dirt road? The freezing cold air made him shiver uncontrollably. As he tried to push himself up from the ground, he wrapped his arms around himself and muttered about how freezing it was. With great difficulty he spoke again, but his words came out awkwardly because his jaw was not moving properly. Frustration built up inside him as he questioned what was wrong with his lips. Before he could think further, another message appeared on the floating screen. This time, it was a health alert, warning him that his jaw had gone out of place from sleeping on the cold, hard ground. A mocking laugh followed the message as if the system found his situation amusing. He shouted at the screen, letting out his irritation about how annoying these alerts were. He knew his jaw was in pain, and he did not need the system to remind him of that. Then, as his anger slowly settled, he accepted the truth of the situation. He thought that he had clearly taken over some character in this story. He wondered if this was a dream, or if everything he was experiencing was real. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to hold his aching jaw. Then, he asked the most important question of all, that who had he taken over? His mind quickly recalled the details of the novel, Knight of Blood and Iron. A horrible realization dawned on him. Among all the characters in the story, the only person who lived in the middle of nowhere and was known for sleeping on the ground was. As Suho tried to process everything, a voice suddenly called out to him, interrupting his thoughts. The voice was firm, addressing him with the words Master Lloyd and telling him that he had been looking everywhere for him. Suho's body stiffened as he slowly turned his head backward, filled with confusion. A man stood before him, his sword tucked at his side, looking at him with a serious expression. Without hesitation, the man told him that they should return to the manor. Suho's heart pounded as his eyes widened in disbelief. He recognized this man immediately. The name and face were exactly as he had imagined while reading the novel. A title flashed in his mind: Javier Azrahan, the protagonist of Knight of Blood and Iron. He thought with shock that Javier looked just like in the book, and then a more terrifying realization hit him. Javier had just called him Lloyd. His mind raced as he pieced everything together. In the book, Javier was a highly skilled swordsman, a legendary figure known for his incredible talent. But at the beginning of the story, he had been just an unknown knight, working under the country lord Arcos Frontera. That meant only one thing. The eldest son of Baron Frontera, the troublemaker, the hooligan of the family, that he had become that person. He was Lloyd Frontera. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when Javier spoke again, noticing Suho's reaction. Javier calmly told him that while he had called his name, he had never called him a hooligan. Then, with a firm smile, Javier added that it was good that he was at least self-aware. Suho felt his frustration rising, but before he could say anything, another message appeared in front of him, informing him that Javier seemed to be in a good mood. Suho thought angrily to himself that he could already see that, and wished the messages would just shut up already. The evening had settled in, casting a warm glow inside the room. Javier sat in front of the fire, letting the heat warm his body. His sharp eyes turned towards Suho, who was sitting on the bed, wrapped tightly in warm cloth. With a calm but serious voice, Javier asked if he had any idea how he had ended up in such a situation. Then, without waiting for an answer, he stood up and looked at Suho before continuing. He explained that Suho had started drinking in the afternoon, got completely drunk, destroyed the furniture in a pub, and then passed out on his way back to the manor. Javier's words made Suho freeze. Inside, he thought about how this really was the daily life of a hooligan. Everything Javier said matched perfectly with what he remembered about Lloyd Frontera's reckless behavior in the novel. Javier then added that Lloyd's father, the lord of the land, had been worried about him. That was why he had been sent to find him. Javier admitted that even though Lloyd was a troublemaker, he was still his lordship's son. If he were to die on the road with his jaw out of place, it would bring sadness to his father. Suho listened with a blank expression, realizing that Javier had a way of slipping in insults so naturally. The coldness of the room suddenly became more noticeable. Suho shivered as he reached out and touched the floor with his hand. The freezing sensation sent chills through his body. He thought to himself how much better it would be if the floor were a heated ondol, like the traditional Korean underfloor heating system. But then he quickly reminded himself that this was a medieval fantasy novel. There was no way such modern comforts would exist here. Javier finally turned away and told Suho that he would leave him to rest. His duty for the night was over, but he also informed Suho that he would report everything that had happened to his lordship in the morning. Suho looked at Javier with frustration and asked if he really had to report everything to his father. Without hesitation, Javier gave a firm nod and confirmed that he did. Suho sighed internally, thinking about how uptight Javier was. As Javier turned to leave, walking toward the exit, Suho suddenly called out to him, telling him to wait. Javier stopped, placing one hand on the door handle, and turned his head slightly. With his usual serious tone, he asked what Master Lloyd needed. Suho hesitated for a moment before asking about the family's financial situation. He wanted to confirm something. He asked if their family had a lot of debt. Javier seemed slightly puzzled by the question and commented on how strange it was for him to ask such a thing. Without giving any further explanation, Javier simply closed the door behind him, leaving Suho alone with his thoughts. As the silence filled the room, Suho sat there, frozen. His mind raced as he thought about what he already knew. He had read this entire story. Just last night, while lying in his tiny, cramped boarding house room, he had finished reading the last chapter. He knew everything that was going to happen. His chest tightened as he recalled the tragic fate that awaited Lloyd Frontera. In the first part of the story, the Baron and Baroness, Lloyd's parents, would be deceived by a ruthless conman. They would lose all their land and wealth, falling into complete ruin. In their despair, they would take their own lives. Lloyd, once an arrogant noble, would then become a beggar, drowning in alcohol and misery. And then, in his final moments, he would cough up blood and die alone. A wave of frustration and anger surged through Suho. He suddenly stood up from the bed and shouted in rage, questioning what the point of being an aristocrat was if his life was going to be just as miserable as it was in Korea. He had been thrown into this world, given the identity of Lloyd Frontera, but what did he gain from it? He gritted his teeth and angrily questioned what kind of person this absolute was. And then, as if answering his thoughts, a memory surfaced in his mind. He remembered the moment when the glowing message had first appeared before him. The alarm had rung, and the words had flashed on the screen that informing him that he had been chosen to have a random wish granted by the Absolute. He questioned what kind of wish he could have made that led him to end up in the body of someone with such a tragic fate. He had been given a second life, but instead of power or wealth, he had inherited a life doomed to misery. The next morning, sunlight filled the manor, marking the beginning of a new day. Suho found himself standing in front of a woman with serious expressions. She was Lloyd's mother, Marbella Frontera. She looked at him with concern and firmly told him that he had broken things at the pub the previous night. Javier stood behind her, silent but observant. Soho blinked in confusion as his mind struggled to keep up with what she was saying. He thought to himself that there was no way he had done such a thing last night. He had been reading a book in his old world. His mother's expression softened with worry as she begged him to go back to the pub and apologize this time. Suho sighed and ran a hand through the back of his hair, still feeling confused about everything. But then, he realized that this was the mess the original Lloyd had created, and now it was his responsibility to clean it up. He nodded and agreed, saying that he would do it. As soon as the words left his mouth, both Marbella and Javier's eyes widened in complete shock. A message appeared in front of him, informing him that these two people were highly confused by his response. Soho groaned internally and wondered if they could not at least give him a little credit for trying to do the right thing. Later that day, Soho and Javier walked side by side along the road toward the pub. As they passed by, a man who had been working nearby saw them approaching. His face immediately changed, and he hurriedly tried to hide. Soho noticed this strange reaction and looked at the man with confusion, but he chose not to say anything and kept walking. However, as they continued, he started noticing the same reaction from other people. Some looked at him in shock, others quickly moved away, and some whispered amongst themselves. The uncomfortable atmosphere made Soho feel puzzled. He could not understand why everyone was acting so strangely. A small child peered out from an upstairs window, curiously watching Soho. But before the child could get a better look, his mother quickly pulled him back and harshly whispered for him not to make eye contact. Then, with a loud bang, she slammed the wooden windows shut, as if trying to block out something dangerous. A message appeared in front of Soho, bluntly stating that the villagers absolutely detested him. He sighed and nodded, already understanding that much. He had seen enough strange and fearful reactions to know that Lloyd Frontera's reputation was beyond terrible. As they walked, Soho turned his head slightly toward Javier, who was calmly walking. With a curious expression, he asked why Javier was following him. Javier, without breaking his stride, placed one hand on the sword and answered simply. He explained that his lordship had ordered him to escort Soho, to make sure that what had happened yesterday would not happen again. Soho frowned in confusion at the word, escort, and asked if that was really necessary. But Javier quickly corrected him. With a serious tone, he clarified that the escort was not for Soho but it was for the villagers. He was protecting them from him. Soho exhaled deeply and muttered to himself, realizing that he was basically being treated like a gangster. As he continued, he thought about his situation. The first thing he needed to do was to get rid of this scumbag image. If he could at least improve how people saw him, then even if he ended up as a beggar in the future, he would still be able to find food. But no, he had to think further than that. If he could somehow deal with his family's debt before everything fell apart, he could change his fate. Instead of ending up as a ruined aristocrat, he could live peacefully as the heir of a country baron. He could have a comfortable life, growing old without worries. Then, a sudden thought struck him. Was there no cheat code or special skill he could use in this world? He was in a novel, after all. There had to be something. His eyes flickered toward the screen in front of him, and then, as if answering his question, something appeared. It was a skill. He had a skill. His eyes scanned the text, and his face twisted in disbelief. The first skill, Human Scum, was a passive ability that caused others to furrow their brows at him. The second, Rowdy Drunkard, when activated, would turn him into an absolute menace. Letting out a deep sigh, he continued walking, lost in thought. Javier, who had been watching him closely, suddenly spoke, his sharp gaze focused on Soho as he asked where he was going. Soho blinked in confusion before realizing. Javier pointed toward the correct path and asked if Soho had been lying about apologizing at the pub. Soho quickly straightened up, shaking his head and assuring him that he was not lying, he had just been thinking about something. Javier, however, continued to study him with a neutral expression, sensing something was off. When Soho noticed Javier's intense stare, he asked if something was wrong, but Javier simply shook his head and said it was nothing before gesturing toward the pub. Taking a deep breath, Soho stepped forward and pushed open the wooden door of the pub. As he entered, he greeted the people inside with a calm and polite, "Hello, excuse me." His voice carried none of the arrogance or hostility the villagers expected from Lloyd Frontera. Javier, watching from behind, narrowed his eyes slightly. Ever since last night, Lloyd had been acting strangely. His words, his mannerisms, everything about him felt different, as if he had become a completely different person overnight. Inside the pub, there was all broken chairs and tables were shattered around, and Soho slowly walked toward a seat and lowered his head. With a sincere tone, he admitted that everything that had happened the previous night had been his fault and apologized. The pub owner's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he stared at Soho in disbelief. A new message flashed before Soho's eyes, informing him that the pub owner had assumed a state of extreme high alert. Before Soho could react, the pub owner suddenly raised both hands in surrender, his voice shaking as he begged for Master Lloyd not to do anything rash. Soho sitting there, watching the pub owner, and thought to himself with confusion. He realized that the man seemed even more terrified because Lloyd, known for being a scumbag, was suddenly being polite. Trying to change the situation, Soho decided to be a little ruder. He straightened up and said, "Well, I guess I am sorry." However, as soon as he spoke, a message appeared on the screen, telling him that his apology didn't seem very genuine. Frustrated, Soho muttered to himself, wondering what he was supposed to do. The pub owner, hearing Soho's words, responded with a shaky voice, telling him it was fine and that there was no need to apologize. Soho's eyes widened in surprise at the unexpected reaction. Later, Soho and Javier were walking side by side when Soho mentioned that even after apologizing, the pub owner did not seem all that happy. Javier, in his usual calm tone, explained that it was to be expected. The pub owner had lost a lot of furniture and decorations the previous night, all of which had been purchased with his hard-earned money. Javier pointed out that the pub owner likely would not be satisfied until he was compensated for the damages. Soho, still worried about their family's debt, thought to himself that compensating the pub owner would be difficult, especially with so much debt already hanging over them. He wondered why it was so hard to gain brownie points with the villagers. Javier continued explaining that not only had Soho destroyed the pub, but the pub owner's mother was also sick from the cold weather, making things even harder for him. Soho realized that the situation was much worse than he had initially thought. Soho noticed that the inside of the pub was quite chilly. The single fireplace was not enough to heat the entire building, and he realized that elderly people would not be able to handle the cold for long. He thought about how things would be better if they had andal floors, the traditional Korean underfloor heating system, which would keep the place warm. Suddenly, an idea flickered in his mind. With wide eyes, he stopped walking, feeling as if a light bulb had gone off in his head. He realized that if he built andal floors in this world, they would be in high demand. The thought excited him. He smiled and clenched his fist, thinking about how the hooligan Lloyd Frontera would never have come up with this, but Soho Kim, the real person inside, could. Soho had studied civil engineering in school and had experience as a military engineer, even constructing a house on his own. He had worked on construction sites, gaining a lot of hands-on knowledge. With this idea, Soho felt confident that he could help pay off all of the Baron's debts. Excited by the plan, Soho started walking again, telling Javier that they needed to go back to the pub. Javier asked why, and Soho replied with a chuckle, saying it was to get his first order. Just then, a notification appeared on the screen, informing Soho that his true journey had begun. The RP system had been activated, and he could now earn RP means relationship points by improving relationships with key characters. The message also showed that his current RP total was 0. Soho's eyes widened as he looked at the screen, realizing that this new system could help him along the way. Soho stared at the glowing screen in front of him, his face thoughtful as he tried to make sense of the message. He wondered if RP was like experience points, and why there were no details about how to use them. His eyes narrowed as he read the next part, which mentioned improving relationships with key characters. A new message popped up on the screen, confirming that RP could be earned by building better relationships. Curious, Soho turned to Javier. He was sure he had discovered something important. But as soon as he checked his status, another message appeared, showing his approval rating at -30. He quickly guessed that the number was extremely low, probably much worse than it should be. Hoping to change that, he called out to Javier, who was standing with a serious and respectful expression, waiting for his command. Soho smiled, deciding to try an easy approach. He told Javier that he thought he was very good looking, expecting to gain some favor. However, another message appeared on the screen, stating that Lloyd was trying to buy Javier's favor. Before Soho could process that, Javier replied in a calm but uninterested voice, saying that he already knew that. Soho barely had time to react when another notification appeared. Instead of improving, his approval rating had dropped by another point, now sitting at -31. His confusion deepened as he looked at the screen. He couldn't understand why his attempt had failed so badly. Frustrated, he sighed and decided to stop thinking about it for now. If he kept rushing things, he feared that he would only make the situation worse. With that thought, he turned and walked away, leaving the issue for another time. Suho sat inside a pub, gripping a piece of paper in his hands as his eyes widened with excitement. He finally understood how things were supposed to work. He would be the builder, and the other person, the pub owner sitting across from him, would be the purchaser. Determined to push his plan forward, he placed the paper firmly on the table between them and flashed a confident smile. He explained his idea clearly that he would erase all construction fees in exchange for covering the cost of the damage he had caused to the property. Without giving the pub owner a chance to object, he urged him to sign the paper. Just as he waited for the pub owner's response, a message appeared on the screen, warning him that the man was looking at him suspiciously. Suho clicked his tongue in frustration, realizing the main problem that nobody trusted this guy, meaning negotiations would always be difficult. Before he could think of a solution, another message popped up, announcing that the pub owner had activated a skill called Stonewall Heart, which made it clear that convincing him would not be easy. Suho knew he could not afford to fail right at the beginning. He had come up with a great plan, and he was not ready to give up so soon. If persuasion was not working, he would have to use a different approach. Deciding to take advantage of the rough reputation of the body he was now in, he spoke again, putting on a friendly but firm tone. He reassured the pub owner that they would be seeing each other a lot from now on, so it was best to build trust between them. To his relief, the pub owner finally picked up the pen and started signing the document. Suho grinned, feeling victorious. His plan had worked, and he had secured his first official job. Another message popped up, calling him absolute garbage, but he only smiled wider. He did not care about that. All that mattered was that he had succeeded. With a satisfied expression, he rolled up the signed paper and tucked it safely into his inner pocket, feeling proud of himself. Suho smiled firmly as he reassured him that he had made the right choice. He promised that he would not let him down. Later, Suho and Javier stood outside the pub, the wooden door behind them. Suho held his shovel in one hand, lost in thought as he planned his next steps. He figured that since the space was going to be cozy, he did not need to be too precise with his measurements. He was about to start working when Javier's sharp voice called out to him, addressing him as Master Lloyd. Suho turned to him and responded casually, but Javier's expression remained serious. His eyes narrowed as he accused Suho of threatening the pub owner into signing the contract. He questioned whether Suho was simply coming up with new ways to cause trouble. Suho tilted his head slightly, studying Javier before responding. He pointed out that Javier was not as reasonable as he seemed. Then, he asked if Javier had ever heard of cognitive distortion. Javier looked at him in confusion, repeating the term as if he had never come across it before. Taking the chance to explain, Suho confidently told him that cognitive distortion was when people assumed someone would act in a certain way just because of their past actions. He said it was caused by prejudice and negative thinking clinging to the brain, making people judge others unfairly. Javier, still serious, rejected the idea. He argued that it was not prejudice, it was based on experience and statistics. Suho, however, was quick to counter, asking if experience and statistics were not all based on the past. Javier stayed silent, looking at Suho, unable to come up with an immediate response. He found himself wondering if Suho had always been this smooth of a talker. Suho firmly embedded his shovel into the soil, using his foot to push it deeper while bending down slightly. His eyes held determination as he made a promise to himself that he would make the pub owner and his mother smile. No matter what, he would bring them happiness. But as he flung the dirt to the side, a sly grin spread across his face. Those smiles, he thought, would become the foundation of his money-making plan. He wasted no time and got to work, scooping out dirt, moving it, packing it, and repeating the process over and over again. The timber for construction was already prepared. It was stored in the warehouse at the Baron's residence. He planned to build using a traditional timber frame, a method that relied on strong wooden logs. Thinking ahead, Suho decided to use clay he had dug from the river to complete the walls. However, after working tirelessly, he finally collapsed onto the ground, his entire body covered in sweat. He was exhausted. His breath was heavy, and he could not ignore how weak his body felt. It was frustrating, but his mind was sharp, but his physical condition could not keep up with his ambitions. Javier stood nearby, watching him with a blank but observant expression. He commented that the work had been completed quickly, in just 3 cuts. Soho, still sitting on the ground, looked up at him with disbelief. To him, it had taken an entire week of effort, not just a few simple cuts. Javier remained silent, his sharp gaze locked onto Soho. He could not help but think seriously about what he had just witnessed. Soho was actually building something. He worked with real skill and dedication, something completely unexpected. Javier could not figure out where Soho had learned all this. More than anything, he found it impossible to believe that Lloyd Frontera, the notorious hooligan, was truly planning to honor his contract with the pub owner. It just did not make sense. Soho's body trembled as he pushed himself up from the ground. His legs felt weak, and he bent forward, placing both hands on his knees to support himself. His muscles ached, and every movement sent a wave of soreness through his body. But despite his exhaustion, he refused to stop. He reminded himself that there was no time to rest. Determined to keep going, he grabbed an axe. He lifted it high above his head, stretching his arms as he let out a strained scream, trying to gather enough strength to cut the wooden logs. But before he could bring the axe down, Javier suddenly stepped in. With a firm grip, he caught the axe and held Soho by the shoulder, stopping him from swinging. Without a word, Javier effortlessly took the axe from Soho's hands, gripping it tightly. His sharp gaze was steady as he asked what needed to be done. Soho quickly gave him instructions, explaining that he needed thin wooden pieces, each one about 2 hands' length tall, 1 hand's length wide, and as thick as a finger. Without hesitation, Javier picked up a heavy log with one hand and tossed it into the air. As it floated for a brief second, he swung the axe with incredible speed, slicing the logs cleanly. The cut pieces clattered onto the ground in perfect sizes, exactly as Soho had described. Soho's eyes widened in shock, his mouth falling open in disbelief. He stared at Javier's precision and skill, completely amazed. Without thinking, he gave him a big thumbs up, his mind racing. This man was truly someone on the path to becoming a master swordsman. Who even needed modern equipment when someone like Javier existed? A wide grin spread across Soho's face as he stepped forward, placing a hand on Javier's shoulder from behind. With a playful but hopeful tone, he suggested that once Javier was done cutting wood, he could help with the digging as well. Javier narrowed his sharp eyes as he watched Soho, feeling a wave of irritation. Instead of showing gratitude for his help, Soho had the audacity to assign him more work. Javier sighed internally, thinking that this man was truly hopeless. Just then, a message appeared on the screen, stating that Javier regretted his decision. Soho quickly caught on to his thoughts. With a knowing smile, he asked if Javier was helping because he was curious. He pointed out that Javier must be wondering how someone like him, who had a bad reputation, was planning to pull off a con. Soho confidently claimed that Javier wanted to see what would happen next. Then, without waiting for a response, he continued, saying that since they both wanted to see the outcome, they should finish the work faster. And how would they do that? By working together. Javier remained silent, watching Soho closely. He could not deny that Soho had changed completely in just a few days. But no matter how different he acted now, his past made it impossible to fully trust him. The only thing Javier could do was speed up the work and see for himself what Soho was really up to. With that unspoken agreement, both of them got to work. They scooped up the dirt, flung it aside, and repeated the process over and over again. Soho moved energetically, twirling his shovel before slamming it into the ground with enthusiasm. After hours of effort, he suddenly lifted his fist into the air and shouted with excitement, declaring that construction was complete. Javier glanced around, his eyes landing on a wooden sign. Something about it caught his attention, and he asked if those markings were letters or some kind of logo. Soho explained that it was his brand's logo. He claimed that having a brand was important, as if it were an obvious thing. Then, with an amused glint in his eyes, he looked at Javier and suggested that they go and find out exactly what kind of scheme he had prepared for the pub owner. Inside the newly built wooden house, warm steam filled the air, wrapping around the pub owner's mother as she lay comfortably on the floor. The pub owner sat beside her, watching in amazement as she smiled, something he had not seen in a long time. With a delighted expression, she praised Soho, saying that the warmth of the room was lovely. She sighed in relief, happily exclaiming that all her stiff joints felt relaxed for the first time in years. The pub owner could not hide his shock. He questioned how this was even possible, unable to believe the effect the room was having. Meanwhile, Soho stood nearby, watching them with a pleased smile. He knew exactly why they were so surprised. This world had never seen anything like the Andal floor system. To them, it must have felt like magic. The warmth spreading evenly through the floor was something entirely new. The pub owner turned to Suho, his voice filled with gratitude. He thanked him sincerely, saying that it had been so long since he had seen his mother smile like this. There was a deep warmth in his tone, a genuine happiness that could not be faked. Standing behind Suho, Javier silently observed everything, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. He had heard Suho claim that he would make the pub owner and his mother smile, but he never expected it to actually happen. It made no sense. Lloyd Frontera was known for causing trouble, not for working hard or keeping his promises. And yet here he was, building something with his own hands, doing exactly what he had said he would. Javier's sharp eyes studied Suho's back carefully. Could he really have done all this just to make those two people smile? The pub owner and his mother were happy. Somehow, against all logic, Suho had made it happen. A message appeared on the screen, notifying Suho of his progress. Javier's approval rating had increased by 2 points, bringing the total to 29. Additionally, Suho had earned 36 RP for slightly improving his relationship with a key character. Seeing this, Suho turned his head with a smug smile, confidently stating that he knew exactly what Javier was thinking, something along the lines of, "This guy is not total garbage after all." Javier, however, remained serious and immediately denied it. Without missing a beat, Suho insisted that he was definitely thinking that. Javier firmly repeated that he was not. Suho simply smiled to himself, choosing not to argue further. It did not matter what Javier said, progress had been made, even if it was just a little. His thoughts then shifted to the bigger picture. Despite making progress, he knew that financially, this project was a total loss. The cost of the timber alone had wiped out any potential profit. But that did not concern him at all. This house was not built for money because it was his model house, something he would use as a demonstration to attract future business. A few days later, the wooden house had become a local sensation. A large crowd had gathered outside, eagerly waiting for their turn to step inside. The word had spread fast, and people wanted to experience it for themselves. As one man exited the house, he wiped the sweat from his forehead with a relieved sigh, exclaiming that he had felt like he was going to melt from the warmth inside. Another man, hearing this, widened his eyes in surprise and asked if it was really that effective. Suho sat comfortably on a chair, tapping his fingers on the table with a confident smile. He looked at the man in front of him and spoke with excitement, praising the amazing warmth of the house. He then leaned forward, grinning as he pointed out that the man probably wanted a room like this in his own home. Without waiting for a response, he pulled out a paper and, showing the drawn structures, he enthusiastically explained the options that Style A was an annex in the yard, while Style B involved remodeling an existing home. Then, with a salesman's charm, he sweetened the deal, offering a 10% discount on construction if the man ordered both styles. The man hesitated, opening his mouth to respond, but before he could finish his sentence, a message appeared on the screen. The notification bluntly stated that the villagers did not trust him. Suho waved off their doubts with carelessness. He reminded them that they would be seeing each other often and urged them to trust him. But then, switching tactics, he suddenly shouted with exaggerated emotion, dramatically asking if they truly did not trust him. He played the role of the victim, claiming that at this price, he was practically giving it away. Before he could push any further, a deep voice called his name from behind. It was his father, Arcos Frontera, standing there with a stern expression. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. A message appeared on the screen, showing that Suho's approval rating had dropped significantly to 20. Feeling the weight of the situation, Suho slowly turned his head, his sharp eyes meeting his father's gaze. The sun shone brightly over the grand manor as Suho and Arcos sat across from each other, sharing a quiet lunch. The room was filled with the soft clinking. Suho cast a cautious glance at Lloyd's father, his mind racing with worry. He had managed to avoid a direct conversation with him until now, but what if he opposed his construction plans? What if he stopped him from building? Lloyd's father placed his fork down and looked at him with sharp eyes, his voice firm as he spoke. He wanted to know what Suho was up to this time. There was no escaping the conversation. Suho decided to keep things simple and replied in his best rude Lloyd voice, explaining that the pub owner had ordered an andal room, and he had built it for him. He tried to make it sound casual, but his father's expression remained unreadable. Arcos questioned him further. He already seemed to know the answer, but he asked anyway, were the other people of the land also placing orders? Soho, chewing his food, made a sound of acknowledgement before replying that his father seemed to know everything already. Arko's expression grew more serious as he reminded Soho of their duty. The people of the land relied on them, and he would not tolerate any lies or tricks. Soho answered without hesitation, assuring him that he had no intention of deceiving anyone. He was not planning anything shady, so there was no need to worry. Still, he could not help but think bitterly about how everyone always assumed the worst of him, no matter what he did. Finishing his meal, he pushed his chair back and stood up. If the conversation was over, he saw no reason to stay any longer. He announced his departure, before turning swiftly on his heels. His thoughts screamed at him to run, get out of here, go. Without looking back, he hurried away, eager to escape the tense atmosphere of the room. Arko's words filled with concern. He wanted to know if Soho was doing all of this because of their family's situation. He reminded him that he had eyes and ears, so he must already know what was going on. But he told Soho not to worry. He believed he could fix things and promised to get them out of this trouble soon. He urged Soho not to get too involved. Soho turned his head slightly, his mind drifting back to the past. He had heard those words before. A memory surfaced at his father's voice from years ago, full of confidence, telling him that everything would be fine, that there was nothing to worry about. He had told him to keep his head down and study hard. A small, bitter smile formed on Soho's face. Back then, he had truly believed those words. He had thought everything would be okay. But now, he knew better. He called his father a liar in his heart, not because out of anger, but out of disappointment. He knew things were not okay. He refused to be miserable again because of something as foolish as money. With sharp eyes and steady steps, he moved toward the exit. His voice was firm as he spoke, telling Lloyd's father not to give up, because he would not either. As he walked away, he was lost in thought. He wished he had said those words to his father back then. Maybe things would have been different. He pushed those thoughts aside and focused on reality. He mentally counted right now, they had 32 orders for Style A and 57 orders for Style B. He had already received half of the construction money. As he was deep in thought, two men appeared in front of him, walking with purpose. Moneylender Meatloaf and Moneylender Shiloh. He expected them to stop and acknowledge him. But to his surprise, they passed him without a single word. His eyes widened as he turned his head back, watching them. He could not believe it. He was the son of the Lord, yet they did not even stop to greet him. His mind raced. Who were those two? Something about them felt off. Meanwhile, in another part of the manor, Shiloh sat at a table, his tone filled with impatience as he addressed Arcos. He demanded to know how much longer he planned to delay things. Meatloaf, standing firmly in front of him, added to the pressure. 5 days had already passed since the agreed date. If Arcos continued to stall, they would have no choice but to take action. Arcos remained silent. Shiloh grew frustrated, crossing his arms before raising his voice. He mocked him, asking if he had lost his ability to speak. He even suggested that if he sold some of the valuable items in the manor, he could easily come up with the money. From the small gap in the door, Soho listened to every word. A sly smile formed on his face. The timing was perfect. These men had arrived at just the right moment. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of him, displaying his current RP was 36. His eyes flickered toward the screen as he sat on his bed, crossing his arms and legs in thought. He had gained some RP after improving Javier's opinion of him. Now, the real question was that how should he use it? Another message appeared on the screen, explaining that Soho could invest his RP to gain abilities. His eyes widened in surprise. Finally, the system was actually explaining things properly. He could not help but comment on it, calling the pop-up punk for finally making sense. But before he could enjoy the moment, another message flashed across the screen, bluntly telling him to forget it. Soho immediately apologized, raising his hands slightly as if the system could hear him. He promised to stop and asked for forgiveness. The screen started loading, and a strange energy circle formed beneath his feet. His eyes widened in shock as he felt a shift in the air around him. Then, one by one, messages began appearing, listing various skills he had: that soil mechanics, hydraulics, structural mechanics, water supply and sewage theory, steel structure design and concrete design, and even advanced design programming. The list kept going, overwhelming him. Just as he was processing everything, another message popped up, saying that he knew more than he looked. Soho let out a frustrated shout, feeling personally attacked. Did the system really need to say that? He had a scholarship, for crying out loud. More messages appeared, now showing the skills he could unlock based on his existing knowledge. Basic surveying required 15 RP, and basic design needed 20 RP. Soho stared at the options, deep in thought. The descriptions were too vague, and he could not tell exactly what those skills would do just from their names. Then, another message appeared, reminding him that his current RP was 36. He sighed, deciding there was no harm in trying. He had enough RP, so he might as well click and see what happened. Without hesitation, he selected basic surveying. The moment he clicked, a bright energy flickered inside his mind. His body tensed as a strange sensation spread through him, his thoughts scrambling in confusion. What was this? He burst through the doors with overwhelming excitement, as he took in the sight before him. His mind raced as he thought, was this for real? He did not need a GPS surveyor. He could see everything with his own eyes. The realization sent a thrill through him, and without hesitation, he made his choice. Skill name was Basic Design. Instantly, his hands moved with precision as he designed a house at an incredible speed. His thoughts rushed forward. No way. Before this, he had spent endless hours, working tirelessly, scribbling down plans for the channels. The struggle had been real, but now, everything felt so much easier. The progress was clear, yet a new question formed in his mind. Would Javier alone be enough to handle all the construction? It would be a huge task, and as he calculated the work ahead, another thought hit him. If only he could summon some heavy machinery using his knowledge, things would be far more efficient. Just then, a message appeared on the screen, catching his attention. If you want to summon, there is something. His eyes widened as he exclaimed in disbelief, what really? The screen flickered, and another message appeared. Random summon game. Spend RP to pick a summon. Unique personalities. A wide range of skills. Enter now to get your own loyal summon partner. His gaze locked onto the words, his mind trying to process. It looked just like an advertisement for a premium game. Random summon game. The screen displayed a single option. Start. The cost was clearly listed that one turn required 50 RP. His mind clicked instantly as if he barely had 1 RP to his name. The summon system intrigued him. If it worked the way he thought it did, it could be as valuable as heavy machinery itself. The problem was clear RP. He needed more of it, and fast. His only way to gain RP was to make key characters like him. That was his next mission. At that moment, Meatloaf's hand slammed down hard on the table, his face twisting into a cruel smile. He looked directly at Arcos, and suggested that if Baron Frontera had no money, perhaps he should consider selling the Baroness and her ladies to a nice place, where they could be sold for a hefty sum. His voice was full of greed and malice. Arcos, completely outraged by this suggestion, shouted in anger, demanding to know how Meatloaf dared speak to him in such a way. Just then, Soho entered the scene. As he walked up, he calmly placed his arm on Meatloaf's shoulder, showing that he was not afraid of the situation. He spoke to Meatloaf, telling him that just because he was a lender, it did not mean he had the right to be so rude and lacking in manners. Meatloaf, clearly taken aback by the interruption, moved forward in surprise and demanded to know who he was. As soon as Arcos called out his name, Meatloaf's confusion only grew. He then asked if this was Lloyd, the eldest son with the strange and peculiar manners that had earned him a reputation. He was clearly annoyed and irritated that Lloyd's son was now interfering with their conversation. He coolly told that if he did not leave before Meatloaf could continue, Soho did not hesitate to respond and demanded, show him warrant. Meatloaf was left confused and shocked. He did not understand what Soho meant by that. Soho calmly explained the law to Meatloaf. He quoted the Royal Family and Nobility Act, specifically Article 3, Clause 6, which stated that all nobles had the right to protect their interests as vassals of the king. He emphasized that entering the residence of a noble family without a warrant was considered trespassing. Soho's words were sharp, making it clear to Meatloaf that his actions were not just rude, but illegal. Meatloaf, in complete panic, shouted while demanding to know what Soho was talking about. He claimed that he had never even heard of such a law before. Soho, acting dramatically surprised, asking if Meatloaf really did not know about the law. Soho then called out for Javier. Javier quickly appeared at the door and, with respect, asked if Soho needed something. Without hesitation, Soho ordered Javier to cut off Meatloaf's arm. Javier stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Meatloaf, shocked by the sudden turn of events, shouted in confusion, asking what was going on. Shiloh, who was also panicked, screamed that they would sue Soho for this. Soho, still smiling, calmly replied that they would see whose side the judge would take in the matter. As Javier unsheathed his sword, both Meatloaf and Shiloh grew even more frantic, their mouths open in fear. Meatloaf, with anger in his voice, demanded to know if Soho thought he would get away with this. Shiloh added that they would regret this decision. Both moneylenders turned and fled, slamming the door loudly behind them. Soho shook his head with a smile, calling them absurd. At this point, Arcos, who had been silent until now, called out for both Lloyd and Javier. Standing up from his chair, clearly angry, he leaned forward while placing both hands on the table. He demanded to know what Soho had just done, clearly upset that they did not have enough resources to handle such a situation. As Arcos continued to express his frustration, Soho calmly placed the sack on the table, his confident smile unwavering. He explained that he had originally planned to give this money to Arcos after collecting all the payments from the orders, but now it should be enough to cover a large portion of the month's interest. However, Arcos was not pleased. He questioned Soho, demanding to know if he had really taken money from their people. He accused Soho of extorting money from them, clearly furious at the idea. Before Soho could respond, Javier stepped, speaking in a calm and reassuring tone. He told Arcos not to worry, promising that he would personally make sure that Master Lloyd fulfilled all the orders. Soho, observing Arcos' reaction, noticed something important, that he completely trusted Javier. Seeing this, Soho decided not to push the matter further. Instead, he showed respect by slightly bowing his head, closing his eyes, and announcing that it was time for them to take their leave. Later, as Soho and Javier walked side by side, Javier broke the silence with a curious question. He wanted to know how Soho had known about such a specific law, since he had always assumed that Soho was the ignorant type. Soho, with a playful tone, told Javier that he had just picked up the law somewhere, asking if Javier was happy with that answer. But in his mind, Soho thought back to where he had really learned about the law. It was from Javier himself, in the book. Soho remembered the moment clearly, that it was right after the Baron and Baroness had committed suicide. The two loan sharks had come to dig up their bodies and sell them. That's when Javier had spoken about the Royal Family and Nobility Act, specifically Article 3, Clause 6. He had explained that all nobles had the right to protect their interests, as vassals of the king. Soho recalled how, after Javier said this, things quickly escalated, and it ended with the loan sharks losing their heads. When Javier was later brought before a judge, he was found not guilty. Soho realized that knowing the content of this story gave him a huge advantage. Just as he thought about it, a notification popped up on his screen. The message showed that Baron Frontera's approval rating of Soho had increased by 6 points, and Soho had earned 60 RP for improving his relationship with a key character. His current RP stood at 61. Soho smiled widely, thinking to himself that everything had gone exactly as he had planned. He was well on his way to his next goal. The night was quiet, and Soho stood alone in the open ground, scanning his surroundings. He glanced around carefully and said with certainty that there was no one else around. Feeling ready, he commanded the system to show him the summon game. A bright message appeared in front of him, displaying the words "Random Summon Game," along with a single option to start. Each turn required 50 RP. Without hesitation, he pressed the start button and thought to himself to begin. A sudden flash of light illuminated the area, and a strange grinding sound filled the air. Soho's eyes widened in shock as he looked upward, trying to make sense of the scene. He thought in amazement, wondering if the glowing formation above him was a magic circle. The way it appeared seemed extravagant and overwhelming. But as he continued to observe, his excitement turned to confusion. The magic circle was unusually small, far tinier than he expected. His thoughts shifted again as he realized how loud and chaotic the summoning process was. The strange sounds coming from the magic circle were almost unbearable. Then, without warning, a small creature leaped out of the glowing formation with an excited scream. The tiny figure landed on the ground with a soft plop before looking directly at Soho. He stood there, completely confused, trying to process what had just happened. His expectations had been high, but what he saw left him disappointed. He muttered to himself, convinced that the summon was a failure. The small hamster, still recovering from its sudden arrival, made a series of odd choking sounds. Suho, already turning away, paused as he heard the noises. He turned his head slightly and questioned the creature. He asked if it was trying to claim that it was not useless. Did it truly believe it could help him? Suho's skepticism was clear as he sarcastically asked if it had some kind of ability, like shooting acorns. Without waiting for an answer, he dismissed the idea, stating flatly that he had no need for such a useless skill. The small hamster let out different sad noises, clearly upset by Suho's reaction. But Suho remained unimpressed and continued speaking, demanding to see what the hamster could actually do. In response, the hamster suddenly plopped something from its mouth onto the ground. Suho picked up the items and sat down to examine them. In one hand, he held a piece of paper, and in the other, a small packet. As he looked closer, he spoke out loud in surprise. The words Podong User Manual were written clearly. He read further and found an introduction that described Podong as an adorable hamster. Hearing this, the little hamster's expression brightened, clearly happy to be acknowledged. Suho continued reading the manual. The text advised him to show lots of love to Podong and to feed it one of the enclosed sunflower seeds. It also mentioned that feeding Podong the seeds would change its size. This new information made Suho more interested, and he shook the packet to see what was inside. 2 different colored sunflower seeds fell onto his palm. He examined them carefully as the manual explained their effects. The red sunflower seed would cause Podong to grow to a gigantic size, with the effect lasting for a maximum of 12 hours. The blue sunflower seed would shrink Podong back to its small size, and it had to be fed before the 12-hour limit was up to reverse the transformation. The manual also mentioned that one set of these sunflower seeds cost 1 Rp. Suho stared at Podong and asked just how big it could grow, wondering if it could reach the size of a person. The hamster responded with a cheerful sound, calling out its own name. Suho realized that he would have to see it for himself. Without wasting time, he took the red sunflower seed and offered it to Podong. As he did, he thought about a possibility. He knew that hamsters were naturally good at tunneling. If Podong could actually grow to the size of a human, then it might become a useful ally. Podong eagerly ate the red sunflower seed, making small sounds as it chewed. Almost instantly, a bright flash of light surrounded the tiny hamster. Suho, still sitting on the ground, was caught off guard. The sudden burst of energy sent him flying backward, and he slammed onto the ground with a hard thud. Groaning, he lifted himself slightly, his eyes widening in pure shock as he looked at what had just happened. His thoughts raced as he stared at the massive figure in front of him. The tiny hamster had transformed into a towering giant. At first, he thought it was about 15 feet tall, but after taking a better look, he realized it was even bigger. No, it was over 30 feet high. Podong stood there proudly. Before Suho could fully process everything, a message suddenly appeared on the screen, revealing Podong's newly unlocked skills. The first skill displayed was digging level 1. Without hesitation, the enormous hamster immediately dug into the ground, lifting up chunks of clay with surprising ease. Another message popped up, this time showing packing dirt level 2. Suho watched as Podong twirled around, somehow managing to compact the loose dirt efficiently. Then, a third message appeared, listing cheek pockets level 1. Right after that, Podong spit something out onto the ground. Suho looked at the item that had just been thrown and muttered the word splash. A big smile stretched across his face, and he clenched his fist with excitement. He had just hit the jackpot. He could not believe it that he had just gotten his own heavy equipment. He started walking, he began to think ahead. There was one problem, though. If anyone suddenly saw him with a giant hamster, it would definitely raise suspicions. Then, an idea struck him, and he smirked. He would simply carry a book on summoning with him, and if anyone questioned him, he would confidently claim to be a summoning master. That way, no one would doubt him. Problem solved. With that settled, he placed his hand on his chest, feeling the small, now resting Podong sleeping peacefully after shrinking back down. Suho admired himself. He thought about how incredibly smart he was, almost not believing it himself. Everything was going perfectly. Now, it was time to move on to the next step. He had to figure out the labor part of their construction project. The sun shone brightly as Suho stood in front of a large group of men, each of them holding a shovel, including himself. He stood tall, ready to take charge, and commanded them to repeat after him. With a loud and confident voice, he shouted that safety came first. However, the response from the men was weak. They mumbled the words lazily. These men were 30 soldiers belonging to Lord Frontera's barony. As Suho observed them, he could not help but feel frustrated. In his mind, they were nothing more than soldiers who got paid to do nothing. The Baron himself was drowning in debt, so Suho could not understand why he was still keeping these men around. Why had not he gotten rid of them? But then, a grin spread across Suho's face as a new thought formed. Thanks to the Baron's poor management, Suho now had free labor at his disposal. If these men had no duties, then he would make sure they had something to do. With renewed energy, he raised his voice, making sure everyone was paying attention. He declared that they were all soldiers, and this was their army. Then, without hesitation, he asked them the purpose of an army. Without waiting for an answer, he gave them one himself. It was to do work. He confidently lifted his shovel onto his shoulder, his eyes sharp with determination. As he looked at the group, memories of his past surfaced. Back when he was in the army, he had spent more time digging holes and pulling weeds than actually training for battle. If he had to go through that, then so would they. Pointing toward a large pile of clay, he directed their attention to it, and informed them that the entire pile had been dug up by him alone the previous night. Deep inside, Suho knew the truth. The massive pile of clay had not been his hard work at all. In reality, Padong had dug it all up in just 30 minutes. Without hesitation, he raised his voice again. He announced that they were about to start something revolutionary at the renaissance of their estate. His grand plan was to bring the Andal construction business to the people, a project that would change everything. But to make it happen, he needed all of them to move the clay to the construction site. The soldiers hesitated. Their faces showed clear worry as they realized how much work this task involved. Suho had expected this reaction. Just as he was thinking about his next move, a voice interrupted him. A man had arrived and addressed him directly, calling him Master Lloyd. Suho turned his head to see who it was. The man continued speaking, questioning what Suho was making his men do. A quick introduction appeared in Suho's mind. This was Newman, a senior knight serving under Lord Frontera's barony. Suho had anticipated that Newman would confront him like this sooner or later. In this land, there were 3 knights. The one standing before him now was Newman, the highest ranked among them. Under him was another knight named Byron. And then, there was Javier Azrahan, the true protagonist of the novel. Suho recalled the story from the book. When the estate eventually fell into ruin, only 2 knights remained loyal until the very end, Javier and Byron. But Newman, he was the first to betray the Baron and flee. In fact, Newman was directly responsible for the downfall. He had secretly sold information about the Baron to con men, leaving him burdened with an enormous debt before abandoning him. Suho thought about it. There was no way he could let this man remain as the land's most respected knight. Suho smiled casually, looking at Newman with confidence before speaking in a relaxed tone. He asked what it looked like he was doing. Newman, however, was not amused. His eyes sharp as he accused Suho of forcing honorable soldiers to cover themselves in dirt. He declared that, as their commander, he would not tolerate such treatment. Suho, on the other hand, saw through Newman's words. He knew exactly what was really bothering the knight. It was not about protecting the soldiers, but it was about money. Newman was upset because Suho was getting close to making real money, money that could actually help pay off the Baron's massive debts. That would ruin Newman's plans. Remaining calm, Suho leaned against his shovel, resting his chin on the wooden stick. With a smirk, he casually informed Newman that he had his father's permission to do this. But Newman was not convinced. His voice was firm as he questioned how Suho had managed to fool Lord Frontera. Then, with a mocking tone, he brought up Suho's past behavior. He openly accused Suho of using the soldiers for personal gain, asking if he was wrong. Suho did not hesitate. With a wide grin, he admitted that Newman's assumption sounded about right if he wanted to get beaten up. Newman visibly flinched. His expression twisted as if Suho's words had struck a nerve. Watching this reaction, Suho could not help but find it amusing. In his mind, he laughed at how fragile Newman was. If this man ever played an online game, Suho imagined his fingers would be flying across the keyboard in frustration, complaining about every little thing. Then, with a sudden movement, Suho slammed his shovel onto the ground, causing dirt to fly up. With a smirk, he thought about how easy it was to push Newman's buttons. He quickly swung the shovel again, this time sending a splash of clay flying straight at Newman. The knight barely had time to react. He raised his arm to block his face, but the damage was done. The soldiers standing around them gasped in shock. No one had ever dared to treat a knight like this. Newman's voice was filled with rage as he shouted, accusing Suho of insulting a knight's honor. But Suho did not care. In his mind, he knew the truth that Newman was nothing more than the son of a poor baron who was about to lose everything. Suho smirked, speaking with complete carelessness, as if none of this mattered to him. He asked Newman if they should forget about ranks and just settle things with a fight. Without waiting for a response, he twirled his shovel in the air, pointing it directly at Newman with a playful grin. Then, with an almost cheerful tone, he suggested something even better: a duel. Newman's anger boiled over. His voice was filled with fury as he declared that Suho would regret this.